Hello, everybody. This is Gary. Today is Sunday, January 5th, 2020. It is 3:57 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States and Rochester, New York. And this is my coping with schizophrenia vlog entry for today. I've made videos on this subject before, and it seems that I have to keep doing it because nobody's listening. I wanted to talk about homelessness and mental illness. I don't pretend to have any solutions for those who are homeless, for example, in Los Angeles, who are not mentally ill. I saw a video on YouTube a couple hours ago that a lot of the homeless people in Los Angeles and San Francisco actually do have jobs, minimum wage jobs. They work full time, but they can't afford to get an apartment, at least not in the San Francisco and Los Angeles areas. Rents are too expensive, and they're certainly not going to buy a home. Um, Rent and mortgages are through the roof in California, and so there are people living out of their cars and vans, and who are working full time, paying taxes. And I have no suggestions on that at all because I don't know enough about it. But I will talk about the mentally ill and homeless people and people who are drug addicts. During the 1980s, the state hospital in Rochester, New York, run by New York State, obviously, was still open. It's They built a new one, but it's much smaller with fewer beds. It's supposed to be cleaner, more modern, better, and it was meant to get people out of the hospital and into outpatient care when they closed the old hospital. The old hospital was a very, well, like a dark tower. I mean, it looked like a nightmare from the outside. It didn't look very welcoming at all, and not that the new one does either. It's got a fence around it. But the people that I knew in the state hospital during the 1980s were not in the best position in the world, but they were better off than they are being homeless and addicted to drugs. Um, some of them had been in the state hospital for 20 or 30 years and were completely unable to function when they were released. Um, they were released for civil rights reasons, which was a good intention but very poorly executed. They were supposed to have their care taken up by community mental health centers, which exist but are nowhere near enough to handle the overload of people who are mentally ill who left the hospital when they closed it. I was there for 8 or 9 months because I had to apply for Medicaid, and I couldn't do that when I was living with my father. So I spent 8 or 9 months in Rochester Psychiatric Center, that's what it was called, um, waiting for a placement in a group home, which I eventually got. And I applied for and received SSI. So I ended up in a group home, which is the first solution to the mentally ill problem. Um, if you stay in a state hospital, back in the 80s, it was like $100 a day in costs, if not more than that, $200-300 a day to keep somebody in a mental hospital. And it only cost $700 a month to keep me in a group home. Of course, group homes are not locked facilities. They're not for everybody. They're not for the severely suicidal and violent. That's not an alternative for them. Um, but it is a start with those who are mentally ill and unable to take care of themselves, but don't need to be in the hospital. The other thing is that after they closed the state hospital and they closed one or two private hospitals in Rochester too, including Genesee Hospital, which used to be on Alexander Street in Rochester, New York. It was closed down for some reason. Actually, the whole hospital was closed down, just leading to the crisis even more for not only less psychiatric hospital beds, but less hospital beds in general. I don't know what happened. The company that owned Genesee Hospital was having financial difficulties. They just spent millions of dollars on building a new maternity birth center, and then they closed that down right after it was built, and the hospital was torn down. I have no idea why. I used to work for that company as a home health aide, and as far as I know, that company no longer exists. But anyways, um, group homes are a good step. More expensive in 2020 than 1987, but they would still be cheaper than apartments and hospitals, and would be much less expensive than putting people in jails and prisons who are mentally ill for breaking the law and the only reason they're breaking the law is because they're unable to take care of themselves. Ben Shapiro, the conservative talker, makes a very good point. As a conservative, he's against government being involved in too many things, being too big, too extensive, big government, that kind of thing is opposed by conservatives. But he did point out that he believes one area the government should be involved in, again, is mental health. I'm not necessarily advocating for rebuilding state hospitals because the government isn't very good at running hospitals, but the government is very good at funding them. In Rochester, there's 2 or 3 private hospitals that are still left, and they're predominantly funded by patients who have Medicaid and Medicare, so they're government funded. And the way patients are treated in them is not all that bad. Yes, there are patients who become violent while they're in the hospital, and they're thrown down and restrained, and it's all legal. There's a procedure for doing that, and it's perfectly acceptable when you are violent and you are harming other people or yourself. That's what a psychiatric hospital is for. And of course, if you're in a hospital and you break the law, you still stand the chance of getting arrested for committing a crime, especially if it's a violent crime or destruction of property. But assaulting people in the mental hospital is not acceptable any more than it would be out on the streets. It's a crime and you go to jail for it, and you should. But a lot of the mentally ill people are going to the jails and prisons for drug crimes, crimes committed while they're delusional and hallucinating and just basically psychotic. And again, that would happen less if people were in group homes with case managers being watched and taken care of. I also advocate rebuilding private mental hospitals to hold those who can't take care of themselves. Ben Shapiro points out that the admission criteria for mental hospitals used to be that if somebody was incapable of taking care of themselves, paying rent, mortgage, work, managing their medical and mental health care, and so on and so forth, then they would be placed in a hospital. And today, Ben Shapiro points out rightly that the criteria for putting somebody in a hospital is only if they're suicidal or violent. If they're unable to take care of themselves, it doesn't matter if they're on their own. They live in the streets, hence Los Angeles and San Francisco. And Rochester, New York also has a homeless population, some of whom are mentally ill, some of them who are not. I advocate rebuilding private hospitals to hold large numbers of patients against their wills if necessary, if they are unable to take care of themselves, if they're potentially violent or potentially suicidal. The civil rights movement that caused deinstitutionalization to start in the 1960s was motivated by governments cutting their budgets because they didn't want to run mental hospitals for the cost. And it was also inspired by civil rights to somehow release the mentally ill because it would protect their civil rights and freedom, which of course it did not. So I advocate building more privately owned mental hospitals to hold patients for long-term care. Because right now, if you go into a mental hospital in Rochester, New York, you might spend a week, maybe 2, and even that's kind of unusual, inside the hospital. Long-term hospitalization is not a thing anymore, and it should be. So I advocate building private mental hospitals for profit if necessary, and have them funded by Medicare and Medicaid. When I go into a mental hospital, it's covered by my Medicare and Medicaid because I'm on Social Security disability as well. And if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to live because I need my medications. I'm on 7 different psychiatric and medical medications. And without them, I would be homeless too, babbling to myself and being psychotic and hearing voices and filled with paranoia. My paranoia is bad enough even with medications. It would only get worse without them. So I advocate rebuilding private mental hospitals and reinstitutionalizing people for long-term care on years if needed. For decades, everybody from the Church of Scientology to civil rights activists have started the process of deinstitutionalization because of their hatred for psychiatry, because of movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and on and on and on, all these different reasons. And in the end, what happens to the mentally ill? They're homeless in county jails and in prisons, which costs the states and cities and counties and towns and villages even more money than it costs to run hospitals. So I advocate rebuilding hospitals and reinstitutionalizing people who are unable to take care of themselves. The criteria should not just be if they're violent or suicidal. If they need to be in the hospital, they should be placed in the hospital against their will, on court order if necessary. And if you try to advocate saying that the mentally ill are better off outside of a mental hospital, then you're a fucking idiot. Because people on the streets of Los Angeles are not in a good position when they're mentally ill. They get addicted to drugs to cope with their mental illness, and that's not any better than what I'm suggesting. Deinstitutionalization has failed, whatever the reasons were for implementing it. There's not enough outpatient community centers to deal with the trouble that's being caused by the mentally ill and homeless people. And going to jails and prisons costs every fucking state in the union more money than it would be to take the suggestions that I'm suggesting. And I guess that's all I really have to say for now. If anybody has any comments, leave them in the comment sections. Share, like, subscribe, and comment.